As we have journeyed through Lent together this year, we have been reading together, considering together, some of the parables that Jesus told during his earthly ministry. Parables, these stories that Jesus told to connect heavenly lessons to earthly situations, to connect the gospel of Jesus' life to the realities of our own lives. And we've considered that these lessons that Jesus taught through these parables are not direct lessons. It's part of the point of telling a parable. You're not just coming out and saying it, you're asking the one you're trying to teach, you're asking the listener of the parable to do some work to arrive at the conclusion with you, for themselves. It's part of what makes them powerful and memorable. We have to do some work. We have to dig through what Jesus is trying to say. Not that he's trying to hide it from us. He just wants us to learn the lesson well. We've seen that sometimes we have to use our imagination to bring these parables forward into our modern lives if we're truly to grasp the full weight of them, the complete lesson Jesus is trying to teach. Other times we have to use our imaginations to go back, to take ourselves back into Jesus' own day. Because the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach, we can't bring it forward so easily into our modern world. The best parables invite us, prompt us to do both, to put ourselves, to anchor ourselves in Jesus' world, and then to bring that lesson forward into our own day, our own time, into our very own lives, our individual lives and our life together here at Kingsway. And one of these parables that entices us to do both, is the parable before us today, the parable of the wicked tenants. The dynamics and impulses at work here are so intrinsic to the human experience, to the human condition. It really doesn't require a lot of imagination. Certainly here in Toronto, we know all about absentee landlords and real estate investors and developers who live in far-off countries. But that's not what's really at the center of the parable. What's at the center of this parable is something far more familiar and far more pressing. It is the human inclination towards violence. Violence as a response to power, to disparity, even to despair. Violence as a means, a strategy to achieve what we want, to gain what we do not have. Violence as an agent and an expression of our fear. It's an impulse as old as Cain and Abel. Even older than that, actually. It has its wellspring all the way back in Eden, when Adam and Eve first started pointing their fingers at each other, at the serpent, at God. The pointed finger is the most basic, rudimentary sight line for aiming and directing our rage. Thursday marked the 51st anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a man whom I would expect many of us would name as one of the most faithful, the most prophetic agents of God's kingdom of recent memory. One of the most effective agents of peace that we have seen in modern times. And yet he was shot, he was killed because of what he stood for, because of what he was trying to do. Today happens to be the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. April 7th, 1994. The killing began, and 100 days later, some 800,000, perhaps as many as 1 million, Rwandans would be dead, mostly Tutsi. And they would be dead at the hands of their neighbors, their friends, their family members. All because the Hutu majority government took to the radio and to the streets, pointing their fingers at the Tutsi, blaming them for the Hutu president's assassination, and urging the Hutu to exact revenge, which they did, with garden tools, with kitchen implements, with virtually any blunt or sharp object they could transform into a weapon. It's anniversaries like these that we need to mark and remember because they have valuable lessons to teach us. But truthfully, we don't need either of these anniversaries to be reminded that our world is a violent place. A review of much more recent history will suffice. The New Zealand mosque shooting, the Quebec mosque shooting, the Charleston church shooting. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Or we could just open the paper today, tomorrow, virtually to any page, on any day. In fact, we don't even need to open the paper or turn on the news. We just need to peer deeply and honestly into our own hearts. Because in our hearts, my heart, your heart, the heart of every living, breathing person, there is an inky darkness, an anger, a resentment, a stress, an envy that lurks right here beneath the surface like oil. And like oil, that inky darkness is easily and highly combustible. It's easy to spot once it's on fire. But once it's on fire, in so many ways, it's too late. It's messy and dangerous and destructive to deal with at that point. We really have to work to contain it before any fire starts. Which is why we have to read the scenario before us today in the parable of the wicked tenants carefully. The burning violence is plain to see. That doesn't mean it's the only place where it exists in this story that Jesus tells us. At first blush, many of us in the Western capitalist world feel a sense of outrage when we first hear this parable. We feel sorry for the landlord. I mean, here he is, enterprising business person. He's built this vineyard. He's made an investment, and he's leased the vineyard out to these tenants, giving them jobs. But then when he comes to collect the agreed-upon rent, or more accurately, when his agents come to collect the agreed-upon rent, the tenants refuse to pay. And not only do they refuse to pay, they attack, they kill, they maim the agents the landlord has sent. Not once, not twice, at least 3 times. Until the landlord says to himself, I will send my son to go and collect the rent. Surely they will respect him. But he is wrong. Because when the son, the heir, comes to collect the rent, they say to themselves, here is the son. Let us kill him and seize his inheritance. At first blush, That is indeed how it reads. But there are quite a few biblical scholars, many of them from South America, from other parts of our developing world, who urge us to slow down and not rush to judgment. They encourage a more careful reading of the scenario. They urge us not to be too quick to judge or dismiss the tenants in this story simply as degenerate thugs. They want us to pay attention to the setting that Jesus is setting the story against. A landlord who lives far away. A landlord who is most likely from that faraway land in which he now resides, who came to this other land to set up this agribusiness enterprise and then to send his agents to come and take the profits of that business back to his faraway land. So it's a scenario in which the community around the vineyard does not benefit, at least not much, from the existence, the creation of this vineyard. They also encourage us to think historically about the terms of these kinds of leases. Because if the arrangements in this parable were anything like most of the arrangements we know of from the historical record, they would not have been very favorable to the tenants. The tenants would have been required to give the owner his profits, first and foremost. And if the vineyard hadn't produced enough to support them afterward, well, then too bad for them. They would have to struggle and suffer as best they could. So behind this parable, there's a pattern of economic disenfranchisement at work, a system that works for the enrichment of the few and the impoverishment of the many, not just today but tomorrow, because remember, the son that they killed would be the landowner's heir. When the landowner died, this property, this business would pass to him, and so the cycle would continue. The tenants think, though, in their twisted anger, their twisted resentment, that if we kill the son, the vineyard will become ours. If not legally, then by default, because the landowner will stop sending his agents to come and collect the rent, so we'll just enjoy it like it's our own. But they're wrong. The landowner is wrong, the tenants are wrong. Because when Jesus asks his listeners, the scribes, the Pharisees, what the owner of this vineyard will do once the tenants have killed his son, they reply, he will put those wretches to death. He will put those wretches to a miserable death. And then he will lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the rent when it is due. So the cycle will perpetuate itself. Not only the economic cycle, but the cycle of violence that is at the heart of it. It's telling that the Pharisees, the scribes, the educated, connected, established people who are listening to this story side with and identify with the landowner. But Jesus doesn't compare them to the landowner. He compares them to the tenants. Have you not heard, have you not read that the stone the chief builders have rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and this is God's doing? It is amazing in our sight. And so the kingdom of heaven will be taken away from you and given to those who will produce fruit for the kingdom. And with no small irony, the scribes, the Pharisees, upon hearing Jesus' pronouncement, respond to Jesus like those very same tenants. Those tenants they never would believe they could be identified with. They wanted to arrest him. And as we know, as the story continues to unfold, it won't be long before they will plot and conspire to kill him. Not just plot and conspire, they actually will kill him. Of course, we could just as easily say they responded like the landowner, the murderous landowner who would put these tenants to death. And that's the real tragedy of the scenario and all such scenarios like this. At the end, there's really no difference. It's all violence. It's all anger. It's all death. As we continue to follow this story through Palm Sunday next week and into Holy Week toward Good Friday, it's important for us to note and remember how Jesus responds to the scribes, the Pharisees, the Roman authorities, when this cycle of violence jumps out of the parable and into real life, into his very real life. Jesus acts and responds in a way that diffuses the cycle, that disrupts the cycle. When the soldiers come for him, he won't strike back. As much as he might have wanted to, as much as we might have wanted to, he will not, and he will chastise his disciples who do. When the court is convened, when it is rigged against him, he will not fight or strike back. He will give himself over to be crucified. He will absorb the violence of people's hearts, of the system, of the cycle. He will give himself over to it. And he will walk out of the empty tomb on Easter Sunday to invite us into a new way of life. The resurrection of Jesus is God's best in response to the world's worst. And that is our hope. That is what the good news is anchored in, what this gospel that we proclaim, that we have all come here today to hear, to rehear, to tell and retell, is all about. That a light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. That there is new life. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. There is another way. This Jesus, of course, calls us not just to hear this good news, but to live it. To live out our lives as his disciples in response to this good news, in this new way. If someone strikes you on one cheek, offer them the other as well. If someone compels you to go 1 mile, offer to go a 2nd mile. Disrupt the pattern, the cycle. Root yourself, ground yourself in this alternative reality, this alternative economy that we refer to as the kingdom of God. Live out this new life. Even though there are no guarantees, as there were no guarantees for Jesus. as he lived out this life, as he gathered disciples around this table. That didn't prevent Judas from betraying him. It's not easy, and there are no guarantees, no matter how faithfully we respond to Jesus' call and live out his summons, his invitation to this new way of life, that it'll be any easier for us. But the question we need to ask ourselves as Jesus' disciples is, how will we participate in the story? How will others outside these walls perceive our participation in the story? As those who are seeking to disrupt the cycle, no matter how imperfectly we may go about it, or as those who simply give ourselves over to the cycle like everyone else? The people that we remember, the people that we celebrate as faithful disciples, people like Martin Luther King Jr., are by and large people who sought to live lives to disrupt the cycle. There was a reason why Martin Luther King practiced a philosophy of nonviolent resistance, because he knew that if we engage a violent system on the system's terms, even if we win, we will be no different than those whom we are fighting against. The result of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, he said, is a blind and toothless nation. They had to disrupt the cycle. And that's why we remember him 51 years and counting later. It's why we also look to Rwanda 25 years later and we see a very different place than we did in 1994. They're still experimenting with what the new way looks like, but they are intentionally trying to do things differently. And one of the things they're doing in Rwanda is that every month they have a nationwide community service day, where every able-bodied adult between the age of 18 and 65 is expected to participate, to go out and do something good for your neighbors, do something good for your community, so that people get to know each other, so that people are invested in one another, so that it becomes all the more unlikely that history will repeat itself in that place. There's no guarantee, but it's making a difference, and it's intentional. We are invited by Jesus once again this month to this table for the same reason. Because while there are no guarantees for us either, it is in the act of gathering around this table, just like Jesus gathered his first disciples. It is this act of remembering, of partaking of this bread broken for us, of drinking of this cup, the cup of salvation, the cup of Jesus' blood spilled for us, not just me, for you, for all of us, for all the world, for all creation. It is in the act of gathering around this table and remembering who Jesus is, remembering who we are in Jesus, remembering who everyone in all the world is in Jesus, that we give ourselves a chance. We give ourselves encouragement. we set out intentionally to live our lives together in a different way, grounded in different assumptions, different expectations, different ways of assessing the success and fruitfulness of our lives. That's why this table is a place of hope. When we remember who Jesus is, we remember what he has taught us. To love each other as I have loved you. And when we ground ourselves in that, no matter how imperfectly, we will be together. We will live together. We will live our lives together in ways that help diffuse and disrupt the cycles of this world. This is the table of hope because it is a table of love. And Jesus meets us here. Jesus calls us on a journey today. He calls us to an identity today, a new identity in him and for him. But it's a journey we do not walk alone. It is a journey he walks with us each and every step of the way. So let us come. Let us eat. Let us remember so that we may live as disciples of the one who has broken and disrupted the cycle of death no longer ends in death. Because of Jesus, it ends in life. And for that, we can truly say, thanks be to God.